What we're talking about today is something that many religious and artistic traditions have expressed for centuries. But now we have some Western scientific paradigms that have language that also describes how extreme hardship can manifest in our bodies and how community connection, celebration, and compassion have a positive effect on our cells. And you might be asking, why are we talking about trauma-informed care at a diversity, inclusion, equity, and justice meeting? I think, as I said, it's important to realize how widespread trauma is, especially traumatic experiences in childhood. But we also need to keep in mind that certain communities have borne a disproportionate amount of trauma due to historic injustices perpetrated by governments, medical centers, other institutions. We've covered that a little bit in other lunch and learns. And so ultimately what trauma-informed care and a trauma-informed mindset is doing is pushing us to think about, shift our questions from what is wrong with a person to what happened to that person and how can I support their healing. So we are actually going to start with a breathing exercise. So this is going to be a little different, but I think it's really important to practice what we preach in the trauma-informed care world. So we're going to have a little mindful minute. So what I'm going to invite everyone to do is, if you want to turn your cameras off, that's totally fine if you feel more comfortable. Or if you feel comfortable with cameras on, you can leave them on. And we are going to close our eyes. I also invite you to close your email. I invite you to flip your phone over so you don't see any notifications coming through. And I invite you to take a deep breath and exhale deeply as well. And this time, when you take a deep breath in, I want you to take that breath in for 4 whole seconds. And then exhale for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And we're going to do that again. Inhale, 1, 2, 3, 4. And exhale, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And now that you're settling into your body a little more, I'd like you to go ahead and drop your shoulders, relax your face, feel your sit bones on your chair, feel your feet on the floor, and tune in to the ground beneath you. And feel that strength from the ground beneath you. Rise up to meet your feet. And feel that strength flow from your feet, up your legs, into your core, and out through your arms to your fingertips. And as you take another deep breath in and a breath out, imagine that this strength is always there, ready for you to pull from whenever you might need a moment of greater stability. And we're going to close with 3 deep breaths in and out at your own pace. And when you're ready, go ahead and move around Open your eyes. Turn your camera back on if you want, and we will return to our Zoom meeting and the topic at hand, trauma-informed care. So thank you for participating in that with me. We're going to talk a lot about resilience today in the next about 20 minutes before we get to our small group activity. And building that individual resilience is so important. And we can do that through mindfulness, through exercise. But another point that I really want to emphasize today is what's on this slide. I grabbed some screenshots that have come from this COVID time. And what these screenshots are really talking about is the difference between individual resilience and community resilience. And the difference between responding to traumatic situations by asking people to take care of it on their own versus responding with a collective mindset in which we go beyond self-care into community care. So I think the pandemic has shown all of us kind of the limits of how far individual resilience can take us, and how much we need to be building compassion into our infrastructure. So I want you to keep that in mind today as well as we're going through some of this information. Okay, so I'm going to go over the definitions of trauma, trauma's effects on our brains and bodies, generational trauma a little bit, and I'm also going to give you some resources to look further into that. We're going to talk about building resilience, and then finally we're going to get to the fun part, which is talking about trauma-informed care principles, and we're going to do a really fun, creative, small group activity, and then hopefully have some time at the end to do a large group debrief. So, trauma. This definition is taken from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Administration, and they define trauma as an event, series of events, or set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, has long-lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. And there's a couple of important points in this definition that I want to call out that are in boldface here. So trauma can be experienced as an acute event, a natural disaster, like a tornado, like the tornado that happened in Nashville, like the Christmas bombing that happened in Nashville. These are acute events that can be traumatic for people. It can also be a series of events or circumstances. So for example, child neglect, where the child feels consistently that there are threats to their life for an ongoing period of time. So both of those circumstances can create trauma. Another important part of this is that trauma is experienced by the individual. So trauma is ultimately perception. So if your body feels that its life is threatened, it can put you into a state of trauma, of experiencing trauma. So there's no objective measure of this is traumatic versus this is not. It's about ultimately the body's perception of what's happening. And then the lasting adverse effects are important. I'm going to talk a lot about how trauma in childhood has developmental effects, but trauma in adulthood as well can create changes in the body. So the second part of trauma that gets a little bit at this kind of series of events idea or set of circumstances is the difference between positive stress and toxic stress. So this diagram is from the Harvard Center on the Developing Child, and I definitely encourage you to check them out because they have a lot of great resources on trauma. So obviously, I think most of us know positive stress can be kind of that growth mindset. Something's difficult, but we get through it and we build skills. And then we have tolerable stress, where something was difficult. We didn't necessarily build skills, but we got through it. And then you have toxic stress. And in situations of toxic stress, what's happening is that your body is ultimately experiencing high allostatic load, and you're getting a lot of wear and tear in your organs, and your body can't get out of that fight, flight, or freeze mode. And so toxic stress, especially in childhood, can have long-lasting impacts. ACEs. How many people, can I get a set of hands, or can you pop in the chat, say yes if you've heard about ACEs, adverse childhood experiences? Okay, a couple people. Okay, so adverse childhood experiences are basically, they're a set of 10 questions that have been validated, but ultimately there are more ACEs than just the 10 that were validated. But adverse childhood experiences are events in childhood, such as child abuse, child neglect, parental incarceration, parental divorce, that cause children to experience perceived threats to life or threats to safety, and then they cause health outcomes later in life. So this is kind of a nice diagram from the CDC that shows some of the long-lasting impacts of childhood trauma. And some of where this original research came from was 1997. There was a study by Kaiser Permanente where they took basically a group of their insured participants, and they gave them 10 questions about various ACEs that they may have experienced, and then they correlated it with health outcomes. And importantly, research since then has found a couple of things. First of all, there's a dose response curve to these ACEs. So the more ACEs you have, the more likely you are to have negative health outcomes. And ACEs are very, very widespread. So in the original Kaiser Permanente study, they found that 2/3 of participants had at least one ACE. And that was way more than they were expecting to find. Especially their cohort was fairly middle class and not typically what researchers might think as participants who may have experienced trauma. But it just went to show how prevalent ACEs are and how much they're affecting people. The other important piece of early childhood, and also this slide is one of those slides where it's pretty intense. So if you have to look away, just look away. So one of the things about ACEs is that there are both behavioral and biological mechanisms that are creating these negative health outcomes later in life. So somebody might say, oh, of course, if your parent drank, you're more likely to drink too much, and then you're more likely to have liver disease. But it turns out that even if you control for those health behaviors, there are still greater outcomes in terms of liver disease, respiratory disease that affect people. So there are biological mechanisms aside from behavioral that are causing negative health outcomes. So the trauma itself is causing negative health outcomes later in life. So this slide is from a systematic review that was published in the Lancet Journal of Public Health in 2017. And it talks a little bit about the relative risk or the odds ratio of developing some of these negative health outcomes later in life. And as you can see, there's a moderate increase in cardiovascular disease. If you've had childhood trauma, there's more of an increase for depression. And then as you go down, the three big ones are violence victimization, violence perpetration, and suicidality. So those, and if you look at the odds ratios, it's insane how much having childhood trauma can increase your risk for these outcomes. And when you see how much this is affecting people, it becomes a rallying cry, I think, to really interrupt these cycles of violence because they have such a huge impact. And if you had a chance to watch the TED Talk from Nadine Burke-Harris, she talks about that a lot. And she is super awesome. Highly recommend that TED Talk. Okay, so where does the brain come in? What does this have to do with neuroscience? Well, basically, trauma, especially in childhood, has a big effect on the development of your limbic system and your prefrontal cortex. So limbic system, emotion, memory, stimulation, prefrontal cortex, planning, complex thoughts. The hippocampus is also in here. So memories and the hippocampus both can be affected developmentally and in the moment in trauma. So we'll kind of talk about that. So in the limbic system, generally, if you experience trauma in childhood, the limbic system is going to get more of your body's growth attention. So you are going to grow your limbic system, and the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus aren't going to get as many resources because the limbic system is helping you with survival. The prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus are not as necessary to survival, so they may not get as many resources as you're growing. And then as you are an adult, you don't have as developed areas in the brain. In situations of acute trauma, what's happening is your prefrontal cortex goes offline. Often your hippocampus also goes offline, so you're not creating memories in the moment. And your amygdala, which is one of the oldest parts of our brain and the controls the fight, flight, or freeze response, is lighting up. So when we're experiencing acute trauma, it's all amygdala, 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 emergency, and not very much rationality, not very much memory making. So that's why sometimes when you talk to trauma survivors about what happened to them and you say things like, why didn't you just say no? Why didn't you do this? Why don't you remember what happened? Ultimately, their brain was not functioning in a way that allowed them to think rationally or remember things. Their brain is functioning in a way that is getting them to survive. So when these systems work well together, they create our personality and executive function. And again, in situations of trauma, basically there's this metaphor about the bandwidth tax. And if you've grown up in a safe, nurturing environment, you have more bandwidth for executive function. And if you've grown up in an environment of trauma, you have more bandwidth towards survival and less bandwidth towards connection. So I do want to mention that these are adaptive responses. So they're not actually disordered responses. They're ordered in relationship to the environment that somebody grew up in. So it is an adaptive stress response to ultimately wire yourself for survival versus wiring for connection. And one of the big problems comes in when we have institutions that expect people to function as if they grew up in a safe environment and don't give space for people who did not grow up in a safe environment and might have different adaptations in their brain or in their bodies. Okay, and then the last important piece of sort of like the biology of what's going on is the sympathetic nervous system versus the parasympathetic nervous system. Sympathetic, fight, flight, freeze. Parasympathetic, rest and digest. So the more that our amygdala is firing off, the more we are in the sympathetic fight, flight, freeze. And that is great. It pumps out adrenaline, it pumps out cortisol, the stress hormones, but it's not great over time. So cortisol over time can have a negative impact on your organs, basically makes you work too hard. And we want to get into situations where we have parasympathetic responses where we're able to rest and digest and repair in our bodies. So generational trauma, this is a piece that put a lot together for me as I was studying. Basically, once again, like in religious traditions, artistic traditions, poetic traditions, for centuries, eons, people have had the language to talk about how much things like genocide or oppression can affect us. And now we have some newer scientific paradigms that are helping us describe what is going on in our body. So on top of our genes, we have the epigenome, which are a group of proteins, histones, and they help turn the genes on and off. And it turns out that trauma can really affect, trauma and resilience can really affect what genes are getting turned on and what genes are getting turned off. So I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail on this now. I am going to have a handout after this that has a couple more resources if you want to learn more about generational trauma and its impacts. But basically, it really kind of speaks on a scientific level to why we need to build compassionate systems and why we are creating, how we create really negative health outcomes in people's bodies when we continue cycles of oppression. And so this is just a little quote from kind of a seminal article in the field by Bonnie Duran and her husband, and then another researcher. And the thing that I liked about this this particular quote is this piece in the middle where they write that historical trauma is characterized as incomplete mourning and the resulting depression absorbed by children from birth onwards. So I thought they did a really good job of kind of melding the science and the poetry there. And I really encourage you to look more into generational trauma if you're interested in issues of oppression and injustice and justice. So we're going to pause for a second. I want you guys to throw in the chat some ideas. And what I want some ideas about are what situations or occupations would a person who's experienced a lot of trauma be good at? What types of occupations or situations might a person who's experienced trauma in childhood thrive in? You can go ahead and chat. I'll try to open up the chat here. Okay, I'm seeing social work, counselor for others going through similar situations, school teacher, medicine, high stress environment, military. Okay, great. Yes, all of those. Any occupation they want, yes. That's actually also a really important point. Genes are not destiny. Just because somebody has experienced trauma does not mean that they can't function in society. Actually, they often function very well. And they have often developed many coping mechanisms on an individual or community level that allow them to function well. The classic example is sort of like emergency medicine or firefighting or some of these life or death situations. People who've experienced trauma are very, very good at. So I just want to hold that up once again as just to emphasize that these are ultimately positive adaptations to the experience that people have gone through. So again, not disordered, but they do come from extreme hardship. Okay, so we've got to ultimately kind of talk about the flip side of trauma, which is resilience, because we don't want people to we don't want people to go through extreme hardship. We want people to be able to thrive in safe and nurturing environments. And so the question is really, how do we create those safe and nurturing environments for ourselves and others? So resilience is the ability to positively adapt in response to adversity due to trauma, threats, or any significant source of stress. And importantly, there are two modes to resilience. Number one is individual characteristics. So that's your own ability to kind of pick yourself up and keep going, but also environmental social support. And I want to emphasize one more time that I think the pandemic has really showed us where the limits of individual characteristics are and how much we need our environmental social supports and how difficult it is when those social supports go away. And so that's why there's just been a huge collective trauma from the pandemic. And I think that, treating yourselves kindly and compassionately during this time is really important. Okay, so individual resilience. Now I want you to pop in the chat, and I apologize, I just made the chat everyone so that everyone can see. So you can either chat just to me or you can chat to everyone. Some examples of individual resilience. So some that I thought about were creating, connecting, celebrating with friends and family, talking to about your feelings or your experiences with a trusted therapist, exercising, practicing mindfulness. These are all kind of evidence-based individual resilience factors. But do you all have any more ideas? Drinking tea every afternoon. What do you do to create resilience? Good night of sleep I'm seeing coming through, different forms of art, journaling, love that. Scheduled times of rest from work, those are great. Okay, and then the other thing that we want to focus on is community resilience. So putting our mental and physical health first in our institutions, family and health friendly work policies, promoting cultures of forgiveness and repair rather than punishment. So restorative justice, and also creating communities of care. And I would love if you have any other ideas of community resilience, if you could post those in the chat while I continue to talk a little bit about kind of like community and infrastructural resilience. So this is a framework that was put out in 2015 that I thought was kind of a nice framework to talk about like trauma on a more communal level and then resilience on a communal level. So these authors talk about symptoms of community trauma in 3 categories, basically opportunities, people, and place. So some symptoms of trauma that may have been experienced on a community level is limited opportunities in terms of employment, disinvestment in the community, intergenerational poverty, and long-term unemployment. In terms of place, we're talking about deteriorated environments and unhealthy products. I would say that one of the symptoms of community trauma can really be kind of traced to some of the injustices in environments. So as we know, people often lower income communities are disproportionately affected by climate change and also disproportionately bear the brunt of pollution, which is absolutely abhorrent in so many ways because basically their health is put at risk just because they weren't necessarily at the table for the decision about where things were placed or where companies were putting their plants. And then another piece of this is people just kind of like a low sense of ability to create change in your own environment. But we can flip this and we can talk about resilience. We can talk about equitable opportunities. How do we create restorative justice? How do we increase community wealth? How do we really invest in communities to create a situation in which people can thrive? How do we create places that are safer for people? How do we improve the built environment to support people's ability to be resilient? And then how do you rebuild social networks, community connection, and really get people the support they need to ultimately thrive? So trauma-informed care gives us a little bit of a roadmap to do just that. So trauma-informed care is ultimately kind of a framework that helps us think about how we can start to build these resilient communities. So trauma-informed care realizes the widespread impact of trauma, recognizes the signs and symptoms of trauma, responds by fully integrating knowledge about trauma into policies, procedures, and practices, and actively seeks to resist re-traumatization. So when you're thinking about doing trauma-informed care implementations, we want to basically say trauma exists, trauma is real, trauma has a real effect on people, and we want to design our space and our policies so that people feel safe and healthy and whole and are thus able to thrive in our environment. And ultimately, you're trying to tip, this is another metaphor that's very common in the trauma-informed care community, but you're trying to tip the scales towards positive outcomes. So you're both trying to move the fulcrum, which is the infrastructure, and you're also trying to give more like individual resilience factors. So we're working both on the community resilience side, our infrastructure, our systems, and we're also focusing on making sure people have the skills they need in terms of mindfulness or self-efficacy. Okay, so this is going to be the last little bit before I send everybody into the small groups to do a creative fun activity. So we're going to talk about the 6 trauma-informed care principles. So these principles were kind of outlined by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Administration, and they are ultimately a roadmap for organizations who want to implement trauma-informed principles and practices into their clinics, into their schools, what have you. So the first one is safety. So when you're creating a trauma-informed environment, you want to think about multiple types of safety. So we want to think about physical safety. How do we make people feel physically safe? That can look like things like leaving doors open, leaving doors unlocked, making sure that people always have a line of sight to the outdoors from wherever they are. That's the kind of thing that makes people feel safe and not trapped physically. It can also be emotional safety. So making sure that people feel welcomed, making sure that people feel like their voice can be heard. These are all things that contribute to emotional safety. So we want to think about both physical and emotional safety there. We also need an environment where there is a high level of trust and transparency. So people need to feel like they can trust each other. And they also need to feel like generally things are transparent. There's no hidden agenda anywhere. And so this can be in like among a staff that see each other every day. It can also be trustworthiness and transparency that's created in the moment, like you would create with your relationship with a participant who's just coming in for one day. Peer support is another important principle in trauma-informed care. So peer support is just what it sounds like, basically making sure that people have the option to speak with their peers, to lean on their peers, and not feel isolated. Collaboration and mutuality, and I'm actually going to do the second one at the same time. So collaboration and mutuality and empowerment, voice, and choice are really important justice-oriented principles in trauma-informed care. So collaboration and mutuality speak about basically the importance of bringing stakeholders to the table in a way that is equitable. So in a way in which the stakeholders actually have the chance to affect the outcome of whatever's happening. So, and that's where the empowerment, voice, and choice comes in as well. So it's not trauma-informed to just kind of do a focus group and get some intel. It is trauma-informed to create a community advisory council who actually has some decision-making power. And then the last one is cultural, historical, and gender issues. So this really gets at the generational trauma piece and addressing generational trauma and acknowledging that that trauma happened, acknowledging that that trauma is happening in many cases, and making sure that there are proper supports in place so that people feel supported in the environment that you've created. Okay, so I want you to keep those in mind while we do a really fun activity. So what I'm gonna have everybody do in just a second is we're gonna break into small groups and we'll take about 10 minutes. And I want you to imagine that you are building a clinic from scratch. And how would you weave trauma-informed principles into the physical space and clinical protocols of your clinic? And I want you to get really creative with this. I want to know the name of your clinic. I want to know how many people you generally serve. I want to know what part of the country you're in. And I'm going to throw some questions in the chat right now. So just to guide you. So we want to look at, we want to look at how would you design your physical space to be trauma-informed? What kind of visit procedures would you put in place? How are you going to train new staff on trauma-informed principles? How do you build flexibility into your protocols to accommodate unexpected reactions from patients? How will you work to build trust with your patients, with staff? And what ways are you building resilience, joy, and emotional safety into your daily operations? So you don't necessarily need to answer all these questions. Mostly I want you to get creative, get your clinic named, and focus on how you can be a trauma-informed clinic. Okay, so I'm going to break everybody. So I want to leave us with this last thought, which is that we know when barriers are removed and resilience is built, people are creative and capable. A trauma-informed approach says we believe in people's ability to thrive. The time is now to build compassion into our systems. And I want to thank you for your attention today and for going on an imagination journey with me into how we can do that through trauma-informed care. Thank you.